I know up to this point it has been an ugly 2023 season, but I still think that Shane Beamer and the South Carolina Gamecocks can go on a run in the month of November.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast and a staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and use code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. I know that some of you are not going to want to hear this on today's show. I know that there are some of you that are very disappointed with how this 2023 season has gone for Shane Beamer and the South Carolina Gamecocks. And with all the losses that they have racked up recently, I believe now they've lost 4 straight games, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, this season is a wash. Let's go ahead and get ready for the 2024 season. But I'm here to tell you today that you should not feel that way, at least not quite yet, because despite the undeniable fact that South Carolina right now is a 2-6 football team, the Gamecocks can absolutely go on a run in the month of November and therefore qualify for a bowl game. If South Carolina wants to make it to a bowl game, they got to win each of the last 4 games in Jacksonville State, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Clemson in that order. But I think that they can pull it off. And there's a couple of reasons why I believe this. The first one relates back to compartmentalizing what all's taken place up to this point in the season. Because yes, South Carolina is 2-6, and the 6 losses have put them in a position where they have to sweep the month of November. And yes, when it comes to maybe some of the injuries that have taken place, some of these guys won't be able to come back maybe the rest of this season, or when they do come back, they will not be 100% healthy. But what has happened up to this point in the season has no effect on the rest of the season. What I mean by that is the results from the past 9 weeks are not going to have any effect on the outcomes of each of these final 4 games. So what happened against the Furman Paladins back in week 2 is not going to have any effect on what the Gamecocks will do against Jacksonville State this coming Saturday. What happened against, say, Florida a couple weeks ago will not have any effect on how the Gamecocks perform against the Kentucky Wildcats in week 12, their second to last game of the season. If this was indeed the case, South Carolina would not have beaten Clemson and Tennessee in 2022 after the way that they had lost to the Florida Gators in week 11 preceding both of those games. Those games, especially a couple of them on the road, as ugly as they might have been at times, don't mean anything now. South Carolina can wipe the slate clean. They can forget what all's happened at this point. All that matters now are the 4 games that remain in front of you. And I know that's the way that Shane Beamer and his staff are going to attack it, and I feel like that's the way that you all should look at it as well. I know as difficult as that might be. The second reason why I think this team can go on a run and win the rest of their games here in the month of November is the fact that this team has not quit, despite the adverse circumstances that have been put in front of them. Now, I will say this. I made a remark on the Sunday Reaction show after the Texas A&M game took place, saying that basically you were stupid if you thought the team had quit. First of all, if you do not like that comment, I sincerely apologize. I certainly do not want to be someone that tries to insult you when I try to make my point or explain my logic behind my rationale. And so I never want to be that kind of podcaster. I greatly apologize for that. I'm going to try to work really hard to make sure that does not happen again. But to get back to this point, if this team had quit over the past couple weeks, then against the Missouri Tigers, South Carolina would have gotten blown out. That was the checkout game, the potential checkout game for this football team. Basically meaning that with everything that has gone on this season, if South Carolina just reached a certain point mentally in that football game, they could have easily just said, you know what, we've had it with this year, we're done, we've given up. Missouri, you can go ahead and take the ball and you can just run with it. Missouri could have beaten South Carolina by 30 plus if the Gamecocks had indeed done that, but that did not happen. South Carolina at multiple times in this matchup in the second half cut their lead down to 2 scores. The Tigers lead down to 2 scores, and at least kept themselves in the ball game, gave themselves a chance to get back in the ball game. Same thing happened against Texas A&M. They gave up 21 unanswered points in the second quarter against the Aggies this past Saturday. That could have been a moment where the team just said, oh, here we go again. We finally have a good start to one of these road games, and then we turn around, and now we're down 2 scores going into halftime. They could have checked out then. They didn't. They cut it down to 1 score at one point in the fourth quarter in College Station this past weekend. If the team had quit in either of those games, that would not have happened. So, if the team's not going to quit in those kind of ball games, then I can tell you right now, playing in front of their home crowd in Williams-Brice Stadium for the final 4 weeks of the season, despite what else happened to this point, this team does not have any quit. Sure, they've got some legitimate problems, some deeply rooted problems, but their resolve is not one of them. So, that is going to be key here if this team is going to go on a run and qualify for a bowl game by the end of November. And here's the last point I want to make. None of the opponents remaining on South Carolina's schedule are unbeatable. South Carolina is playing Jacksonville State, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Clemson. Now, that's not to say that none of those teams are good football teams. A couple of them I do believe are good football teams. But there's not a single team that I throw out there that should make you shake in your shoes and go, we'll be lucky if we win this football game. There's not a single game where you should feel that way. Looking at Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Clemson specifically, those 3 teams are a combined 2-7 on the road at this point this season. A reminder, the Gamecocks get all these games at home in the month of November. South Carolina, yes, they are 2-6 right now, and a big part of that is because of the way they've played on the field. It's also been because of a really crappy hand that they've been dealt in terms of their schedule this year. There are a few teams in the conference, in the SEC, that have played all of their games away from their home stadium before reaching the month of November. South Carolina, I'm pretty sure, is the only one, and 3 of those road games took place against the Georgia Bulldogs, against the Tennessee Volunteers, and against the Texas A&M Aggies. South Carolina, in my opinion, is not that bad of a football team. So, if we apply that logic to these last 4 opponents, South Carolina can absolutely beat each and every one of these teams. You throw that in with all the other points that I've already made, there's no question South Carolina can sweep their final 4 games and make it to a bowl game. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It will not be easy. They're going to be challenged. And we're going to talk about Jacksonville State maybe mounting up a pretty big challenge, a bigger one that some might suspect later in the show, but it is doable. It is absolutely possible. And so, as much as maybe you're tired of having to feel this way, I say keep the faith. Keep the faith and don't throw in the towel yet. This team hasn't. You shouldn't either. So it'll be interesting to see, of course, if the Gamecocks can pull it off as the month of November progresses. But again, I do know that some of y'all, you are already looking ahead towards the future. You're looking at the kind of team that South Carolina is going to possibly be fielding in 2024. And some of the guys that could be taking the field are some really talented true freshmen from this 2024 class. I've been going over some of these players over the past week or so, and we're going to continue to do that today with offensive tackle Kam Pringle, who I will do a deep dive on in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Now, time for your game changer of the week, brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Much like Mario Anderson Jr., Athletic Brewing has been shrugging off their non-alcoholic beer competitors thanks to their great tasting non-alcoholic brews. Their brews are great tasting and award-winning, and they beat out full-strength beers in global competitions. And the best part is, you never have hangovers. Mario Anderson Jr. has been a godsend for this Gamecock rushing attack this season, as he's racked up 92 carries for 468 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. He could literally eclipse 800 yards by season's end. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON at 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer, exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. Today's show is also brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, and LED headlights, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you'll get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to this Monday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily watch on YouTube or your daily listen wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Let's talk about four-star offensive line commit Kam Pringle in the latest edition of Future Gamecock Profiles. Kam Pringle is a kid that South Carolina desperately need to get in this 2024 cycle. When we look back, I think he's going to be looked at as the guy that sort of kick-started the momentum that South Carolina built up this past offseason. Obviously, South Carolina got Dante Reno, their quarterback commit that I'll go over in a little while, back in June, I want to say 2 summers ago at this point, but this past January was when Kam Pringle decided to pull the trigger and commit to Shane Beamer and his program. And it unleashed a string of 4-star commitments for this staff. So, needless to say, his pledge was a big deal on the recruiting trail. How big of a deal is it going to be when it comes to his play on the football field? Well, in terms of the biggest strength, Kam Pringle, he's got a nasty, mean streak to him, and that is exactly what you want in your offensive lineman. This has been a trait that we have seen from a lot of the commits that South Carolina has brought in ever since Shane Beamer took over this football program. They look for guys that play with an edge to them, and again, this is something that you would think that every offensive lineman has, but that's not always the case. And especially when it comes to the SEC, you've got to have a group of guys up front that, quite frankly, just aren't afraid to get after anybody on the football field. Now, in terms of fitting into his position group, how is Kam Pringle going to help out this Gamecock offensive line starting in 2024? Well, South Carolina, based on this year especially, they desperately needed to add some depth and overhaul some of the talent along their offensive line. And when you get a guy that's 6'8", 340 pounds, depending on which recruiting profile you look at, who's a South Carolina native, and he's got some athleticism to boot, that will definitely help to solve those issues. Now, where exactly is Kam Pringle going to slide in along this offensive line? I have to admit, Kam Pringle is a bit of a tough one to peg when it comes to his position fit. But the best way I can narrow it down is I think that Pringle is going to end up playing somewhere on the right side of this Gamecock offensive line throughout his career for a couple of reasons. First of all, he's a stronger run blocker than he is a pass blocker. And traditionally, when you got a guy that's a bit of a better run blocker, you usually are going to play them farther and farther to the right side on your offensive line. Secondly, he's got a massive frame. Just mentioned earlier, 6'8", 340 pounds depending on where you look. And the other thing is, his lateral quickness is a little bit questionable. And this is part of the reason why I could not exactly slot him in one particular area, because if you're playing guard, like maybe Kam Pringle could at the next level, then lateral quickness is something that you've got to have, especially because you're going to be having to move horizontally on outside zone run plays. And if there's a gap run play where, say, maybe there's a pulling blocker, one of the interior guards, you might be the guy that's got to be the pull blocker. It has to go from one side of the formation all the way to the other side to try to kick out a vacated defender on the edge. And so with Kam Pringle, I don't know if he's got enough lateral quickness, at least right now, to where he could do something like that. Now, this was based off of his junior season highlight film, so maybe he has gotten a lot better in that aspect since he posted all that online after his junior season, but I don't know that for certain. So right now, in my opinion, he could be either a guard or a tackle, depending on just how much better he's gotten in that aspect. So in terms of his potential for playing time in year one, I know I've talked up Kam Pringle a lot to this point, but I've got to say, I think that he probably ends up redshirting in his first year here in Columbia, because at this current moment, I just don't see where he fits in the rotation. You've got guys like Trevon Ball, who's going to be coming back and has now got a full year of college experience under his belt, including a bunch of starts. You've got Kason Henry returning from injury after this season. You've got a Tyshawn Wanamaker that's currently on this roster, played right guard and right tackle, and he could end up coming back and maybe try to get some redemption this next season. You've also got Jatavius Shivers, who has gotten better during practice this fall. He's a guy that could have been a player in this rotation next year. I just don't know where Kam Pringle fits positionally on this offensive line or in terms of his snaps. So I would say that in year one, it's more likely that Shane Beamer and this coaching staff basically kind of sits down Kam Pringle and tells him, hey, look, we're definitely glad that you came here, and we think you could be a big part of this offensive line a couple years down the road. But we think you should take this first season to, try to get in better shape, maybe try to burn off some of the weight, some of the baby fat that you might still have on your frame coming out of high school, and just learn the playbook. Obviously, again, it's hard to play on the offensive line as a true freshman. This year might not indicate that with Babalade and Trevon Ball, but I promise you, usually it is not that easy for offensive linemen to pull off. So if Kam Pringle ends up enrolling in January, who knows? Maybe he has a better chance of having a spot in the 2 deep this next fall. But we don't know yet. We'll have to see how this offseason plays out, because that could have playing a massive factor in whether or not Kam Pringle gets any snaps in year one here at South Carolina. Now, this upcoming matchup that the Gamecocks are playing on the football field this coming Saturday, it is an interesting one, because it is going to be a battle of the Gamecocks, the South Carolina Gamecocks, and the Jacksonville State Gamecocks. So what all do you need to know about the Jacksonville State Gamecocks, at least when you look at the surface level statistics? I'm going to touch on some of that in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is really simple to play because you can make your picks and submit your entry in less than 60 seconds. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app out there. Looking at this Monday Night Football game between the Las Vegas Raiders and the Detroit Lions, I think that Detroit quarterback Jared Goff will throw for more than 270.5 passing yards, because the Raiders, while they are pretty good at stopping the run, they're not very good at defending the pass. And the thing is, the Detroit Lions are one of the most balanced offenses in the NFL. So I think Jared Goff, especially playing at home, he's going to have a pretty solid game against the Raiders on Monday night. Do you agree? If so, go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and use code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and promo code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day in just 30 minutes. Let's talk about the Jacksonville State Gamecocks, South Carolina's upcoming opponent. And when looking at this football team, they're pretty good. They are a 7-2 squad right now, and being led by first-year head coach Rich Rodriguez, you might sit there and think that this is a team where their quarterback is the centerpiece behind their success, but that is actually not the case. When you look at this Jacksonville State Gamecocks football team, it's actually their running game and their defense that spearheads their squad. And this reminds me a lot of the Georgia State game from 2022 because of that. Because when looking back at that Georgia State game, one of the first few things I remembered is that their quarterback then, Darren Granger, he had pretty big accuracy issues at the quarterback position. And that is the case with Jacksonville State starter Zion Webb, who up to this point in the season has only completed 50% of his passes, which in today's college football kind of feels like a 40% completion percentage, considering how easy it is to just throw the ball out so quickly and get a completion, have it go count towards your stat line. The other thing is, the offense for Georgia State in 2022, much like this offense for Jacksonville State, was led by their strong rushing attack. The Gamecocks have 5 guys who have rushed for 217 yards or more this season. 4 of them have an average yards per carry mark of 4.4 or higher. So this is a football team that spreads the football around out of the backfield, and they're pretty efficient doing so. Now, the key difference between this Jacksonville State team this year and the Georgia State team that South Carolina played this past season is that the Gamecocks have a really solid defense. And that's evidenced by the rankings that they have in some of these statistical categories. When it comes to scoring defense, Jacksonville State is giving up only an average of 18.8 points per game. That's the 22nd best mark in the country, and only behind Georgia as far as South Carolina's 2023 opponents are concerned. In terms of total defense, Jacksonville State has given up 347.4 yards per game. That ranks 48th in the country, so not quite as good in terms of their scoring defense, but still an above average mark when compared to national averages. Passing defense does seem to be a potential weakness with this team, as they've given up an average of 231.8 passing yards per game. That ranks 73rd in the country. And then in terms of their rush defense, they rank 30th in the country, giving up 115.7 rushing yards per contest. So my overall thoughts on this Jacksonville State defense is that this is a defense that is a bend but don't break unit based on the yardage that they've given up compared to the amount of points that they have given up. In essence, you can drive down the field on this team if you've got the right kind of players, but this is not a team that gives up points very easily. They hunker down when they need to in the most critical moments. So for South Carolina, that is going to make for an interesting matchup because, again, based on the stats here, and obviously based on the clear talent advantage that the South Carolina Gamecocks are going to have in this football game, I would imagine that Spencer Rattler is going to have a good opportunity to put up some numbers here against Jacksonville State. But if South Carolina is forced to put together a bunch of grinded out type drives where they got to drive down the field and they've got to convert in the red zone, which their red zone numbers are actually pretty solid. But as we've all seen this year, when South Carolina gets to about 3rd and 3, 3rd and 2, or 3rd and 1, or it's a goal to go situation, they have to strain and struggle to convert in those situations more often than not. And listen, Conference USA team or not, you rank 22nd in the country in scoring defense heading into week 10 of a college football season, You're a solid defense. You're a good defense. There's no other way of getting around that. So, looking at this team from a pure service level standpoint, Jacksonville State, they are a team to worry about. There's no question about that. Rushing defense for South Carolina, for the most part, has been better this year, but recently they have had some lapses, in particular against the Missouri Tigers, and again last weekend against the Texas A&M Aggies to a certain extent. They've not faced a ground attack like Jacksonville State's all season long, and that is certainly going to make for some interesting strategizing from Clayton White and his staff. On the flip side of the coin, Dow Loggins, you're going to have a good game plan here. You're going to have to make sure that you put this offense in its best position to be successful, because this is a Jacksonville State team that it seems like is willing to give up yardage, but they don't give up big plays very often. Whether it is big plays to get down the field or maybe a big play that leads to a score. So Spencer Rattler and this offense, they have got to be efficient. They cannot be a boomer bust offensive unit like they have been for the majority of this season this coming Saturday afternoon. Because if they are, that is how Jacksonville State not only hangs around, but potentially grabs a stranglehold in this football game. You cannot sleep on the Gamecocks of Jacksonville State this coming Saturday, because if you do, if this team does, then they could end up in a dogfight. And before you know it, this entire possible run that they could go on in the month of November, it could be dashed away just as quickly as it got started in week 10. So with that being said, that does it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show, as always. What are your thoughts on the chances that South Carolina can go on a run in the month of November? What are your thoughts on Kam Pringle and what he could bring to this offensive line unit this next season? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the Fighting Rich Rods of Jacksonville State? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. But once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I will catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.